If I can call now our first panel members to come on up, I'd like to introduce Jim Rankin, who will then, Jim Rankin is our immediate past chairman from Air Wisconsin, and he'll be leading this panel on really the topic that has been going on for so long, and there finally is some, what I would say, some green shoots appearing on the NextGen front. I should add is that we were going to be one of the key panelists who had accepted our invitation to attend here today on this is really the person in charge, and that's David Grizzle, the head of the FAA's ATO, and I spoke with David obviously quite a bit over the last couple of weeks, but as late as last Friday, and I said, David, you know, are you still coming to Montreal? And he says he would have loved to have been here, and it was to number one, say hello to all you, but they're still unraveling all of the mess that was caused all last week. So with that, turn it over to Jim. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Roger, and good morning to everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning to talk about NextGen. Certainly, as Dan mentioned in his comments, NextGen is a vitally important piece of the airline industry and the regional industry in particular going forward. When we look at the airspace system and we look at the technology that we're currently using to run the system, it's actually somewhat amazing. I think back to when I started flying, which was in 1984. I worked at IBM at the time, and I was actually just amazed and blown away because we had one of the very few devices out there that we called the telefax machine, and we actually could send documents across, you know, the telephone system and get a piece of paper out, you know, halfway around the world that you really couldn't read, but you felt better that you actually had it. And here we are in 2013, and the airspace system is still managed pretty close to the way it was back in 1985. Obviously, technology has grown in leaps and bounds, and we haven't really kept up. I think it's unfair to say that we haven't done anything. Obviously, we have evolved the airspace system and our air traffic control system, but certainly not at the speed at which technology has been being implemented in basically everybody's lives. So as Roger mentioned, I'm Jim Rankin. I'm the President and CEO of Air Wisconsin Airlines. We've been around, this is our 48th year, so we're getting very close to our 50th anniversary. It's been great to be part of the RAA, and I was asked about 3.5 years ago to join the RTCA's NextGen Advisory Committee, which is really a group that was tasked by the FAA to make industry recommendations as to how to implement NextGen. And when Roger asked me if I would be a part of that group, I absolutely jumped at the opportunity. Because the NAC is really a broad industry group. There's really only 2 airline representatives. I represent the regionals, and then Bill Ayer from Alaska represents the mainline carriers, but the rest is the industry. So we have the controllers union, we have the OEMs from the aircraft companies, we have the companies that develop and implement the technology itself. We certainly have the FAA as well represented. We have the DoD, since obviously a big user of our airspace is defense. And we have many folks from the international ICAO groups and the European ATC systems as well. So it's a way to try to merge air traffic control and NextGen across the globe, because obviously it's an international issue. So I've been a part of that for the last 3.5, 4 years. It's been a very interesting experience for me, sometimes frustrating, but I think we're at a critical point, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll have the panel talk more about that as we look at 2013 and beyond. So I just want to take a minute and ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their organizations and their own personal backgrounds, and then we'll jump into some issues with NextGen. We do have open mics across the floor, so please feel free. If you have a question, just stand up and I will recognize you in fairly short order. I'd love this to be a very informal discussion amongst the panel members and also amongst you. So please feel free, if you have a question, to stand up and we don't just save them for the end. If it's pertinent to the topic, we certainly would love to talk about it at the time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lee Moak. Lee is the head of ALPA, the Airline Pilots Association. And Lee, if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Captain Lee Moak. I'm the ninth president of the Airline Pilots Association. Our association has been around for 80 years. We have the largest non-governmental safety organization in the world with 400 volunteers and professional staff members. One of our primary safety initiatives has been working with the air traffic controllers, with government, with industry on NextGen. I sat on the panel with Jim, the RTCA panel, the NAC panel, in Washington for the last 2 years. And although we have been making some progress, and trend is, I would say, positive if you forget the furlough of the air traffic controllers a few weeks ago and folks at the FAA being furloughed who work on the NextGen programs. I would say trend is positive, but it's not nearly quick enough. Pilots are trained to fly these approaches. The aircraft and the investment that's been made by the regional industry in particular are capable of flying it, and what stands in the way is really execution to ensure that we're all able to use it day in and day out. So the rest of my remarks I'll leave for the panel, and thanks to Roger Cohen and the group for inviting me to be here.
Great, thank you, Lee. To Lee's left, we have Nancy Graham. Nancy's with ICAO, and she is the Director of Air Navigation Bureau. Nancy.
Thanks very much, and thanks to our AA for inviting us. We actually are just down the street. I often say ICAO is not a place that builds furniture. So if you're not familiar with ICAO, we have two major bureaus. What ICAO does is develop all of the regulation for international aviation. The FARs are derived, for example, from the ICAO annexes. I have 16 of those 19 annexes, everything except security, thank goodness, and the political aspects of environment. What I do as it relates to NextGen and the future is, in fact, you don't want NextGen as it currently stands around the rest of the world. You need a system that the rest of the world can adopt. And while the NAC does focus, and gratefully so, a good bit about the transatlantic partnership, we've had that partnership for 40 years and we still have differences. So what ICAO does is try to build the bridge. And we've built over the last few years together with the industry and with partners around the world, something called the Aviation System Block Upgrades, which takes the best of NextGen, the best of SESAR in Europe, and puts that into small packages that we call modules that the rest of the world can consume, adopt as needed. So I'm happy to share a little bit of that with you, and be happy to take questions from there on.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nancy. To Nancy's left, we have Ruth Stillwell. Ruth is with the International Federation of Air Traffic Controllers Association and has a very extensive background as a controller here in the States and now in her new position. So, Ruth.
Hi, thanks. A little bit about IFATCA, because outside of certain meetings, people haven't really heard of our international federation. NATCA, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association in the U.S., is the U.S. member, but we are the international group that represents controllers from 134 countries around the world. It has been in operation for 52 years as a professional association worldwide, and part of our goal is to develop common standards and procedures and bring the controllers into the discussion so that as they are developed, not only do they represent the controller's interests, but going forward, we can make sure that there's greater adoption of those common procedures and standards. For me personally, I am an air traffic controller. I work in Miami Center when I'm not here in Montreal. I've been there for 22 years prior to serving here as the IFATCA representative to the Air Navigation Commission. I served for 6 years as the Executive Vice President of NATCA. I have a doctorate in public administration and transportation policy. I hate to talk about myself, so I was told I had to read that. But mainly what we do as the International Federation and our member associations is to try and make that connection so that there is room to go outside the walls of an air traffic control center to work with the industry, to work with our partners, and to make sure that we all have a common understanding of what's going on. And I hope that serving on this panel, I'm able to do that. I thank you for the opportunity to present the controller's perspective, and I think that we have a lot to participate in the debate, and I hope you have good questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And to Ruth's left is Neil Planzer. Neil is with the Boeing Corporation, and he's the Vice President of their air traffic management system.
It's air traffic management and airspace, and I represent both Boeing and the Jeppesen company, which does a lot of the work that you're familiar with, including all the things that are in your airplane when you go from point A to point B. Boeing is an interesting view of air traffic management. Boeing's role in air traffic management is that when you look at the backlog of airplanes, and there's about 3,400 on back order, and you look at the capacity of the system, you realize that if the system cannot handle that capacity, we cannot deliver those airplanes. So my job in some ways is to stir the pot, to keep things going, not to accept the status quo, and to keep the bureaucracies, such as the FAA, such as the other ANSPs, such as ICAO, moving in a forward manner. And we want to do that in an aggressive but complementary way. So my background is I was in the Air Force, and then after the Air Force I went to work for the FAA for 25 years as an air traffic controller and did lots of their senior executive roles there. And I then led the Department of Defense's air traffic control system for about 6 years. A lot of people forget that there are 5,000 air traffic controllers in the United States military. So we did that. And then about 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to get hired by Boeing. So Boeing's role is to make the system work better. I'm supposed to help by providing concepts, ideas, through the people that I work with, and we perform those jobs very efficiently, very effectively. We are not selling you boxes. We're not interested in selling you boxes. We're trying to sell the system's growth. And we'll talk more about that with NextGen as we get into the panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Neil. You know, as we talk about NextGen, when we kicked off the first NAC meeting at the RTCA back in 2010, one of the first exercises we did was to develop sort of an elevator speech for NextGen. How do you capture NextGen literally in 15 or 20 seconds for people who really don't know much about it? And the chairman of the group at that time was Dave Barger from JetBlue, and Dave is very big into, he calls word clouds, and so he puts up different words and describes different activities through a series of words. And so we tried to somewhat follow his lead and talk about NextGen more or less with a word cloud. And you know, some of the things that came to our minds as we thought about NextGen was, first of all, obviously safety. I mean, everything we do in the industry, safety has to be first. And so as we think of NextGen, we want to make sure that not only do we get improvements in safety, we certainly don't want to go backwards and erode safety. But the overall task of NextGen is obviously to modernize the system so that we can bring in greater capacity to the system. It wasn't that long ago, back in 2007, we were having pretty significant delays in the system because there were too many flights for what the airspace could handle. And so we're trying to build a system that has higher efficiency and higher capacity, but we have to do that without eroding safety at all. So safety was certainly number one. Number two, we wanted a system that allowed aircraft to move faster because obviously as you look at it from both an efficiency or a throughput, how many aircraft can we get through the airspace, the faster we can get them through, the more aircraft we can handle. And also, obviously, we want it to be cheaper to operate, both from the system itself as well as operating within the system. And if we can get more aircraft on the ground sooner, certainly that saves a huge amount of costs in terms of fuel, but also in terms of maintenance on the aircraft and crews and everything else that's involved in keeping the aircraft flying. And if we can save fuel, we get another byproduct, and that is it can be cleaner. And certainly as we talk about the environment and as we talk about the industry's role in a greener world, we heard about it yesterday with the carbon trading systems in Europe. We want to have a system that facilitates a cleaner industry as well. And overall, we want it to be smarter. So we really do have an opportunity to take a look at what is our current technology and what are some of the areas where technology is going to be going in the next few years, and we want to be smart about how we go forward with that. The interesting thing is, so when you hear all of those, It sounds great. You know, why wouldn't you do it? Why haven't we done it already? Obviously, the end, I think everybody is pretty clear and pretty happy with what the end result would be. It's how do you get there? It gets to be part of the problem. So what I thought I would do is just start this morning and ask the panel. The first question is, you know, what are the benefits from your unique perspectives that NextGen would bring to the air traffic system, to the industry itself? And I thought to start that off, we'd get the highest level view of that, and I would ask Neil to kick us off and just talk about NextGen high level. What do you think are the true benefits of a new modernized air traffic control system?
Boy, that's a great question with really lots of tentacles in it. So let me open up the panel by being direct and candid. NextGen provides some new technologies that are quite good. When you look at the improved use of ADS-B, RNP, required navigational procedures for approaches, the different types of access to airports, especially those served by regional airlines, it provides lots of new technologies. When they started NextGen, it had the intent to be a capacity-enhancing capability. In fact, they talked about 3 times the capacity. And that was the public statement that the Department of Transportation made at the time. Clearly not achievable when they made the statement, not achievable today. They were supposed to be doing it as a 20-year program. It's into its 15th or 16th year, and it's nowhere near reaching those goals. So NextGen has morphed, and it has morphed into an efficiency capability. And in that efficiency capability, you see certain things that are projecting some benefits, whether it's the use of some of the water routes using different technologies that they can use now. There are some benefits into that, direct flights over the Gulf. In reality, it did not meet its expectations, and it hasn't yet shown me how it's going to. So if you were to layer metrics of measurement over NextGen that should have been done in the beginning, but we didn't do that, then you would realize that it's not performing what the basic things are. So we are not reduced any separation. There is no separation reductions coming out of NextGen. So because of that, there are no capacity gains. When you take a look at the significant work that's being done with Greener Skies in Seattle, you realize the potential of NextGen, but when you have converging RNP approaches, there's no standard, so they can't do that. So even though the vision of those benefits are there, the actual getting of those benefits are not there. It hasn't reduced operating costs for the FAA, which should have been one of its goals and arguably was in the beginning. It's layered cost on top of it. And I would argue some of the sequestration issues are the layering of additional costs. There aren't any fewer radars. There aren't any significant reduction in VORs. There aren't any significant reduction in other nav aids. So when you look at NextGen, you really have to look at the value it brings, and I'm not pessimistic. It does bring some small value. The value it brings doesn't equal the cost that we as a spending from the National Treasury. So is NextGen capable of achieving greater dynamics that bring together an increased efficiency and capacity? The answer is, I think it is, but it would require a significant shift in how the FAA approaches these issues. And it's not a controller issue. It's not an application work foundation issue. It is a policy, it is a standards, and it is a bureaucracy-laden issue. So I think NextGen brings us hope at this stage. I don't think it brings us anywhere near the payback for the Treasury we spent on it.
Good. Thank you, Neil. Now I wanted to just ask Nancy if you could comment a little bit about NextGen and how it would work in the coordination between all of the different entities that control aircraft as they traverse around the globe.
I neglected to say when I introduced myself that I'm formerly FAA, so I'm going to be very direct about that because I'm going to defend the FAA at this point. Most of the modern ideas about high-density air traffic control and air traffic management come from the West, come from the U.S., Canada, and Europe. And so I think the benefits associated with NextGen are clear. I think it has, and I think the FAA has had for a very long time, a problem with communications. The fact of the matter is that you have an extraordinarily safe system that's pretty damn efficient and continues to be managed, that growth continues to be managed, which is not the case around the rest of the world. So just the name NextGen implies that you're never going to get there. During my time at the FAA, there were 11 systems upgraded and installed that were major enhancements, and I was there 10-ish years, and that was relatively not well publicized. So all the criticism that we as Americans, and I'm going to talk about in terms of criticizing the system, it works, and it works well. Are there new things needed? Yes. But there are also new ways of doing business. So I absolutely agree with Neil. The challenges that the FAA face is that it has to acquire a new air traffic system or an upgrade to an air traffic control system. It has to go through the same kinds of bureaucratic crap, and I do mean crap, that IRS does for an IT system. And it's a 24-hour-a-day business. So really, I think there needs to be a change in that structure, and I have always been one for corporatization for the air navigation service system. There are many, 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 many models around the world that have demonstrated that that is an extraordinarily effective step. And so I think the U.S. Congress really ought to get off their duff and do something about that. But, you know, I live in Canada, so I can say that. What was your question? No. Your question was about the rest of the world and how it applies to the rest of the world. Look, the rest of the world is going to adopt what is fundamentally coming from the high-density states. The question is, how do you package that in such a way that it doesn't require extraordinary equipage by region, and that you have similar procedures that allow for the similar structure of safety around the world. That is an ongoing challenge. I will say that there is extraordinary contribution from the US, from Canada, from Europe, from some of the Latin American states in trying to make that happen. And this aviation system block upgrades structure we put in place is to enable that. But we're at the very early days of that. What you will see in the future is more transparency as states begin to adopt that about what they have adopted. But fundamentally, we're going to have to come to the conclusion that for a few things in the future, we're going to have global mandates. There's no way otherwise. Otherwise, you continue to see this lack of integration between the expense on board the aircraft and the expense on the ground. And until you get all of those things lined up, you don't get the benefits that Neil talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so true. And you bring up a number of points that we're going to talk about over the course of our time up here. So I think it'll be a very interesting discussion as we talk about funding and equipage and privatization potentially. So I think that's very good. I appreciate that. And Ruth, you really are sort of the practitioner of NextGen in the group that you work with. So from a controller's aspect or perspective, what do you think are the real benefits of a new system?
I'm really happy to have the chance to answer that question because the system's not been upgraded in 30 years. The bureaucracy is impossible, and we've upgraded it 11 times. And so when we talk about NextGen, I think a big question is whether there's some agreement on what it really is, because for Congress, it's a budgetary category. For the FAA, it's a series of projects. And I think for the industry, it's a concept and a vision about how we'll move forward. But for air traffic controllers, it's something else entirely. So I like to present the kind of inside view of what's happened so far and how NextGen's different, because you are all correct. You didn't really see any big changes in the air traffic control system, because what we did when we upgraded 11 systems is the FAA invested in largely and gained their capacity increases over the last 30 years, because remember, we have a huge increase in air traffic and zero increase in air traffic controllers. So we have had this tremendous productivity increase because I can work more airplanes. And I will tell you, I'm not complaining about that. Because of the technology we implemented over my career, I can work airplanes a lot easier than I did before. That's how I'm able to work more of them. But that was internal FAA. We automated most of the controller-to-controller interactions. And by doing that, we made the controllers more efficient, and we were able to deliver you more efficiency. But you didn't see it because you don't get involved in the controller-to-controller interactions. We've squeezed all we can out of that. And when you compare the US system and the European system, the big difference is that the European systems still have a lot of opportunity to automate those controller interactions. And so while they bring their systems functionally up to the standards of the US, although from a new box standpoint, they have newer boxes, the functionality is still increasing. They'll show greater improvements than the US will because they still have that opportunity. The problem, and why NextGen is so controversial, is in order to get that next jump in capacity enhancements, we have to do it outside the FAA. And it's between the industry and the system and how it interacts. And that's a more difficult challenge because you don't have one airplane that you need to upgrade. You can't just say, well, tomorrow my fleet will be all equipped and ready to go. It takes time to do that fleet equipage. I will tell you, while the FAA was doing that internal upgrading, you all did a lot of upgrading of your airplanes. One of the main reasons why in the same airspace I can put a lot more airplanes is because there's GPS on those airplanes and you're not navigating over radio beacons. That changes how I can work and what I can do, and is a big difference in the workload. When I started as a controller, 99% of the flights were slant alpha. Today, 99% of the flights are navigating point to point by some sort of technology. But 3 times a day, I get I hope I'm not offending anyone, a Silver Wings, and he is slant alpha. There's not a lot I can do to shorten that guy's route in a busy sector because the workload to manage an aircraft on a vector that I have to intercept an airway is 10 times the workload of me giving a guy direct to a fix. So for NextGen to work, it's that partnership. So I like to make the analogy, in the last 30 years, we were dating. You upgraded your airplanes, we increased the system, we improved the system, you decided if you wanted to upgrade your airplanes to make advantage of it. We all dressed up nice and impressed each other, and that was fine, and it was really pleasant. But for NextGen, we're married. And boy, we have to make these decisions together because anything we spend here comes out of over here. And so we need to make sure that those upgrades are something that you can take advantage of, and more importantly, something you will take advantage of. So, you know, I mentioned the slant alpha, and Neil sends me a little note, tell them what it is. Well, that's navigating via radio beacons and airways. So in this marriage, there's a big policy debate, and Neil mentioned it. And I see on the horizon the significant policy debate of NextGen is going to be service priority, and whether or not we move from this service priority that we call first come, first serve, but isn't really, it's actually the operational advantage, whatever makes my sector work the most efficiently, to a purchase priority where the equipment on the airplane gets you an initiative and an advantage. And in order for that to happen, somebody or many somebodies get a disadvantage. So the question for the regionals is, are you going to be the ones that get that disadvantage? The speaker this morning talked about sequestration and that you got an unfair hit in the delays. Will that be the same issue moving forward? That policy debate is the most critical part of NextGen and where the benefits will come and who will receive them. And it is a much bigger issue than whether or not Congress funds purchasing a box or a new technology. That policy debate will drive the future, and you need to be part of it.
Yeah, no, and I really do appreciate that comment. When you think of the airspace system the way it's always been set up, it's really been a first come, first served system. And as Ruth was saying, you know, we're looking now at should we have it best equipped, first served, as an incentive to try to get users of the airspace to make the investment. But there is a critical mass issue. You know, you can make the investment, but if you're behind slant alphas all day, you're probably not getting a whole lot of benefit from the system either. So we'll touch on some of those aspects in just a little bit as well. And Lee, your group, you're the end users. So you should be seeing all of the benefits of NextGen in day-to-day. Do you want to talk just a little bit about, from a pilot's perspective, and not just from NextGen in the United States, but also from pilots that are flying across the world, how they see the interrelationship of ATC and some of the benefits that may be coming?
Great. I would like to take it a little different and kind of complete the circle on what we're talking about, but I'd like to take it from the ground to 35,000 feet And I'd like to distinguish early on the difference between DOT, FAA, and air traffic controllers. And there's definitely a difference, and it's important that I think your group recognizes that. If you take it from the ground, and we'll just use a pairing that most of you all are familiar with, let's just go from Washington, D.C. to New York, all right? If you go from Washington, D.C. to New York, currently, depending on the day, whether it's good weather or weather causing challenges, you take off and you're immediately not flying to the full capability of your aircraft, and you are actually sent to points that are on the same nav aids that have been there since the 40s. And you were slowed, you were put into holding, and then finally you're allowed to vector in and land at LaGuardia, okay? So the point I want to make with that is what the pilot is capable of doing, what the controller has the equipment to do, okay? What the plane is capable of doing, okay, is the subject of many different subgroups, not only here, but with other groups, whether it's fuel efficiency or the environment. And if you were to take it all together, okay, and put it and connect it back to DOT in a second, you should be able to take off, climb to altitude for fuel efficiency, fly direct to LaGuardia, descend fuel efficiently and quickly, and then vector over, and fly without vectors in an environmentally friendly fashion in a curved approach to land at LaGuardia without having to talk with anybody, okay? You actually have the capability to do that. So that would help with the environment, that would help with noise in communities, that would be fuel efficient. The planes, the controllers can do all of that. Now, if you take that for just a minute and park it, and you talk about DOT, the Department of Transportation, if you go on their website, you know, they're responsible for multiple modes of transportation, but the big one is high-speed rail, and they like to talk about that. High-speed rail between Washington and New York. And of course, it doesn't really connect the airports, but you know, that's for a European discussion in a minute. But I believe high-speed rail is a small jet or a large jet flying this routing. In fact, high-speed rail is 200 knots on a good day, or miles per hour, right? But an aircraft is capable of going 300 or 400 miles an hour and doing that route very quickly and very efficiently. But in Washington, through the confusion there, they're putting money into high-speed rail and not focused on our industry, which is where they should be focused on aviation, on NextGen, on these capabilities, and not high-speed rail, and definitely not stage coaches, all right? So now back to this. I would disagree just slightly that the FAA now doesn't have a communication problem. The FAA has an execution problem, and we should all recognize this, because all the parties can do the things that I just said. They can do it. The planes can do it, you want to do it, the pilots can fly it, the controllers can do it, okay? But the FAA is not able to have a system in place that you can execute and make that a reality. Now, we have some one-offs, which you know, Jim. We have some one-offs out in Seattle where they've been able to do that. But the time it takes to put an approach in like that you can fly, Boeing can have a meeting, engineers get together and come up with the idea of the 787 and put it into service quicker than we can put an approach in place in the bureaucracy of the FAA. So it's an execution problem that we should all recognize, because we have a lot of people working on different components of this, all right? But the reality is, if we step back for a minute and look what we want, and then have a system put in place that allows us to do what we want to do, vice 11 upgrades, without still being able to do what we need to do. So that's my thoughts.
That's
on
good. Yes,
NextGen.
thank you. You know, and everybody that just answered that question seemed to touch on policy and the political aspect of it. And I want to get into that, but before we do, let me just open this up, and I'll just open it up for the panel rather than to any one individual. Are there any technical barriers to NextGen, or are we there? We have the technology, we know what to use. Can anybody identify a technical barrier to NextGen right now?
Well, let's talk about CPDLC. So we bought CPDLC, okay, we equipped it.
Do you want to explain that?
Computer pilot
controller
data link.
pilot
Controller
data.
pilot data.
Excuse me, not computer yet, right? Controller pilot data link. And we put it in place and we trained for it, and where do we use it? We use it over the North Atlantic, okay? We're not using it in the US. And the reality here is that system was a great system, it's an advanced system, and companies made the investment in it. It's developed, but again, we should be doing that. And what's the holdup on that? Everybody's trained. The holdup comes back to an FAA bureaucracy, I believe.
I would disagree on that, and I appreciate you bringing up CPDLC because Miami Center was the test facility for CPDLC, and we've got a nice poster, and it is actually on my scope, CPDLC off. Unfortunately, and it's not a technological barrier, the technology is fine, and it works great. Until you have the fleet equipage levels, it's not a practical system. We need to get the fleet equipped to a level that can appreciate it, and the difficulty that came to the CPDLC program was 9/11. And unfortunately, we've not gotten back on track post 9/11 to say, let's make this investment. But the fleet equipage is what is required to make that technology successful, ADS-B technology successful. The next-gen big projects all depend on this partnership, that until we reach certain levels of fleet equipage, we really don't get any advantage out of the system.
I want to just add, and then I'll turn it back to Neil. So I could accept that as a policy decision, but this chicken or the egg theory that we're talking about here, if you talk about capabilities, which was brought up earlier, best equipped, first come, first served, best equipped, Cat 3 approaches it's a great example. Okay, so if someone's not capable of doing a Cat 3 approach, he's going to divert, but the company that's invested in it, because the equipage is there, he's allowed, controllers are trained, pilots are trained, aircraft are equipped. He's allowed to fly that Cat 3 approach in. Airport is invested in lighting systems, brings you in. Their operation, the operational integrity of that airline is protected, okay? With CPDLC, just like you could use with the concept of certain RMP approaches, again, from a policy viewpoint, we should be using it as much as practical. The people that can't use it should be manual, because there is no incentive for them to ever come on the program. The idea that we're going to ever have these global mandates is great in a panel, but it's hard enough to get anything done in the U.S., much less have ICAO mandating something that people aren't going to follow. So I think CPDLC works fantastic. The only thing is, it's been around for a long time, and it should be used more.
Neil.
So I want to bring in a couple of pieces that everybody talked about and see if I can bundle them together. Obviously, we're always going to have a mixed fleet issue in perpetuity. That's always going to be there. You have to have processes and procedures to handle a mixed fleet, just like we did in 1950, 60, 70, 80, 90, and 2050. CPDLC, by the way, was on the initial installation concepts of CPDLC, as I think was my good friend to my right over here, Nancy. I would tell you that's a 30-year-old concept. There is no technology difficulties. I do agree that it's an execution piece. I think when you deal with bureaucracies that do not have a bottom line, then you always have outcomes that you don't drive to. So I like Nancy's comment. By the way, NAV Canada, the Canadian ANSP model, is probably one of the most successful globally as an independent operating ANSP. And they've solved a lot of their mixed fleet. Now you can argue capacity is lower here, but it's not low. It's just not quite as dense as the US. But they're a very effective, capable, technology-driven company, and they execute very well. So when you look at what the bottom line brings, when Boeing, and thank you for the mention of the 787, when Boeing created the 787 or Airbus the A350, they made promises. They made outcome promises, just like Bombardier does and just like Embraer does. When you buy that airplane, you are told what you will receive, and you make a business case to buy that airplane. If you fail as the manufacturer to provide that outcome, then you have penalties that you must pay to the purchaser. You must pay to the purchaser. So if you follow the news, although I'm not going to tell you the number, Boeing's paying penalties for the battery problem on the 787, not fixing it, because the customers who bought it did not get the use of it that they were promised. There are no outcomes for air traffic control. There just aren't any. And I'm not talking about what the controller does, I'm talking about the system. So it doesn't drive costs down. It doesn't drive efficiency up as an outcome. It doesn't have the ability to improve safety as an outcome. When you look at the way the bureaucracy works, let's talk about parallel runways. Simple piece of, and there's lots of them. Parallel runways by statute have to be about 3/4 of a mile apart, 4,300 feet. That number was made up. It was made up because it seemed like a good number at the time. There is no doubt with the new technology that you mentioned, GPS, and that we were talking about on ADS-B, and we're talking about Category 3 and RMP approaches, that you can run parallel runways a lot closer, simultaneous approaches, less than 4,300 feet. The FAA will not approve it. 10 years ago, they decided they were going to do 2,500 feet, and then it just kind of died. If you get it down to a LaGuardia a Newark distance of 900 feet, and don't get panicky there, Lee, but you can theoretically do that. Think about all those 4,300 and beyond parallels at the big airports, at the Denvers and the Dallases. You could actually pave a runway down the middle without procuring additional land. You can make procedures and processes. To do that, you must have an economic outcome. I'm not minimizing a safety outcome. It must have a tomb of documents showing it's safe. We're not even started doing those safety case analysis. That's just, parallel runways is just one. Converging RMP approaches. I mean, it's astonishing how effective they are in Seattle, but you can only use them in VFR conditions. Because nobody wants to allow, nobody, the FAA is not willing to do the safety case analysis. And I think a privatization brings you that bottom line, and the safety is still maintained by the government piece. I think the controllers do what they're asked to do. So I got to tell you, if people tell you this, the controller issue, I disagree with that. I have for a very long time, because I was one, and maybe that's probably slanting my view, but they always do what you ask them to do. They're not saying, oh, we're not going to do that. If we do not put our heads focusing on outcomes of NextGen, just like manufacturers produce outcomes on aircraft, we will never get what we think we are going to see that is the promise of NextGen. Not a technology issue at all. There's no new inventions needed. I think Lee's example of CPDLC is a classic. I understand the mixed fleet problem. I understand it from a controller standpoint. The technology works all the time. The military's been using that type of communications capability, not CPDLC, between military aircraft and AWACS all the time. They're sent back and forth all the time, and it's encrypted. But that's a different level. So my sense is, whether it's the Regional Airline Association, whether it's the NAC, whether it's a FATCA, whether it's ICAO, if we all are poking at the problem and saying, you must do better, it won't get fixed. My complaint about the NAC, and I've been pretty vocal about it, is it just agrees with everything. It's not the driving force it was envisioned to be. And until it has to be part of this, as RAA does, promises there, technology there, execution is not there. Privatization would help, and I understand there'll be issues for unions, but those are workable. NAV Canada controllers seem very happy in a privatized system. So I think that's my input on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we'll get to privatization in just a minute. Before we leave the technical, Nancy, I just want to see if you have any thoughts on any technical barriers, and then we'll get into some of the political aspects.
I completely agree with the rest of the panelists. There are no technical issues. We know everything we need to know about the technology. And I completely agree with Neil in terms of the operational outcomes should be the focus, and that's how we've structured the aviation system block upgrades for the rest of the world. What I worry about for the West is today, Asia has surpassed growth of Europe. They're the number 2 in terms of traffic growth. Very soon they'll be number 1. And the ideas are going to come from there. So the bureaucracy that you speak of and the challenges that are spoken of in terms of the inability to execute, and I don't disagree with that entirely. I'd stick up for the FAA a little bit, but in fact, they don't have those problems. They say build an airport, they build an airport. There's something to be said for that, folks. So I think that the U.S. sort of needs to get its act together, and there just isn't a reason why this can't happen. I just don't understand it, and we don't have the corner on the market of all the ideas. Corporatization is a great idea. I hate to call it privatization because I don't think that's what's really meant, but that I have to say is a good idea. But I think it would distract. It would be distracting for the system for the moment. But nevertheless, I think that there are no technical issues. They really are around policy and execution.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, when we came into Montreal just a couple of days ago, NAV Canada gave a series of FAM rides to anybody who wanted to go, and we shot a couple of RMP approaches and LMP approaches. And technology's there, it works. You know, as a guy who pays the fuel bill at an airline, it wasn't lost on me as we were shooting some of these approaches that the throttles were very, very quiet. And so we were doing some fairly elaborate turning arrivals into hilly terrain where normal ground-based signals can get obstructed, and the airplane was just functioning extremely efficiently. The throttles were back, and we were basically just coming in for a landing. So I think I agree with the panel. I think technically we're there. And as you've all talked about, it's a political issue, seems to be. So let's touch on that just a little bit more, and then we can get into some potential solutions like privatization. But until we get into that, let's just talk a little bit about the politics of it. And Ruth, I'll start with you. If you want to just give us your sense, certainly with your background and being part of the ATC system and the FAA's organization from that perspective, what do you think is the real political issue as to why we can't get this thing moving forward if we have the technology at our hands?
Well, I mean, the big political issue is the same political issue for everything, which is money. And the sequestration really highlighted how budgetary shenanigans can affect long-term planning in a fairly significant way. But it wasn't just sequestration. It was 19 FAA reauthorization extensions before that. And unfortunately, right now in the United States, aviation is not a high political priority. And it wasn't a high political priority until flights started to get delayed. And then in 3 days, it became a crisis. So a little bit of it is that our safety standard has been very high for a very long time. And that builds complacency when it comes to safety. But the service delivery has been, regardless of anybody's individual experience with air travel, has been at sort of a level state for quite some time as well. There hasn't been peaks and valleys. Our big delay years come and go. 99 was front page of the papers every day. The year of delays. 2007 we saw that spike again, but an economic collapse sort of alleviates that pressure pretty quickly. So in terms of this long-term aviation being important to our country and what it does, we don't have that reputation at the moment. There are times in history where we have. Significant investments have been made. But without being overly crass, we're not killing very many people. And the service level is maybe not great, but it's not any worse than it has been for the last couple of years. So there's no outcry. There's no, we need to do this, we need a long-term plan. The industry is very enthusiastic about NextGen and thinks it needs money, but outside of the industry, did the other 320 million people really talk about NextGen? Right. Not very much. So you have that political problem. One thing that I would like to touch on, because people talk about privatization a lot, and NAV Canada a well-run company, and they were able to upgrade their systems. But what they did when they came in was close 12 towers. And in a country that's 1/10 the size population-wise of the United States, that's enormous. So when we talk about what the speakers talked about today and the community need for air service and air travel, we need to look at all the consequences. That, you know, on the surface, things sound like, oh, it worked here, that's great, but what really happened? And so because we have a political benefit that there is a desire for Congress to ensure that air service is provided to medium and small communities, that it's not just a business model for the FAA. If it were just a business model, we'd eliminate a lot of service. And boy, would we put some money in that Northeast corridor to get the planes from Washington to New York. And maybe if we shut the planes coming from other places and gave priority to that Washington, New York corridor, we could do exactly what Lee talked about. But when you have that broader view, we get a benefit from the politics, but that benefit comes at a very high price. And that very high price is this political bureaucracy and wrangling. So for me, I think the big political issue with NextGen, more than anything, is that aviation is not a high priority in the United States at this time. And that's a problem for all of us.
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting because when you think of all the rounds of stimulus this country has gone through in the last 5 years, and we haven't used any money really on NextGen. And I think a lot of it is it's invisible. If we build a bridge, people can point and say that's what we did, right? But when we build a NextGen, you can't point to that and say that's what we did and have the voters see it and see some benefit of it. Neil.
Well, I listened and I'm trying to understand. I think we were moving in a couple of different directions. I think the key point that I liked that you made was over the 19 reauthorizations. We're doing the same thing over and over again, and we're expecting a different result. It's not going to happen. What you do is you take it off budget.
Exactly.
That's what a corporatized system does. That's what NAV Canada does. So you're not funding your money every year. You can have a strategic view. You can issue bonds. You can build an infrastructure over time. I think that's one key piece that is absolutely missing. The closing of towers are towers that should be closed. Does anybody really think that the United States needs 21 centers to operate the air traffic control system, or that the Europeans need 72? Those are cultural and political issues. So I'm not saying that you close all but one. So you maybe want to go down to 6. It is a 25-year program to consolidate those. So at least start. You know, we had a conversation, and I talked to a couple of administrators about it, is that if I wanted to consolidate the centers, the first thing I would say is anybody working at them today does not have to move in their career. They can stay there till they retire. Why? Because they're not closing them for 25 years. Every new employee has to understand when they get hired that there is a possibility that they'll have to move. The cost of operating those buildings built in the 60s and constantly upgrading them, and you know what that's like, is an enormous expense. A privatized company, a corporatized company, would look at that and come up with a solution. The architecture requirements for towers. We're putting towers in place as contract towers where there aren't any airplanes. The towers the controllers outnumber the hourly flow of traffic. If a community wants that, I'm okay with that. The community should pay for that. And they can. You can reduce the cost in a lot of different ways that a privatized, corporatized organization could do that a government cannot. So I'm not saying that you just go out willy-nilly closing towers. The political issue is every congressperson protects that facility within their district. I'm real quickly going to tell you a story when I was with the FAA, and this is 25 years ago, and we were putting in a system of automated weather observing systems, and I was responsible for those. And there was a place in Hobart, Maine, that had 6 weather observers, and we were going to put in the system in there and remove the paid weather observers. And the reason we chose Hobart is in the 1 year prior to that, they had 1 instrument operation. 1 instrument operation. So we made the announcement, I got a call from the administrator at the time, and we went to see Olympia Snowe, who was the senator, and she said to me, "You're not removing that. You can put it in there, but the weather observers stay. That's my poorest county in Maine, and we're keeping it open, and those are very well-paid jobs. So I don't care what you put in there, but they're not leaving." So that is a governmental political issue. I'm not making the social decision that those people should have been unemployed. I'm simply saying from an economic standpoint, it doesn't make any logical sense. Even if they doubled their instrument operations to 2, it didn't make sense. So when you look across the broad spectrum, the bureaucracy is designed to respond to the politics, which is designed to become not a business outcome, not a outcome of process or execution, but of a social outcome. That's why the poor Europeans are killing, they don't know what to do. Does Greece need its own center? Does Cyprus need 2 centers? So all of that plays well, and the privatization, corporatization model has an effect. And you would, by the way, the US tried to do that under the Clinton administration, called the United States Air Traffic System. It was USATS, and it failed. The Republicans opposed it.
Interestingly enough.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the same system would be opposed by the Democrats. The politics in the United States, and it may be the same, is so venomous that if I say good morning, they say good evening. That is a problem. It is a problem for WRTA. It's a problem for the FAA. And it's created, I think, even though WRTA is political, I think he's not executing in a political agenda, so I think he's doing okay.
And Lee, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Well, just a couple. Hey, look, I believe the Canada experiment is a great one. But I believe down in the U.S. that there's a couple of fundamental precepts that we need to, at some point, have maybe a longer discussion. But every time you have a bureaucracy hiccup like we've had at the FAA, there's always the people that come out of the woodwork and say privatization is the answer. And let's remember, privatization, they can go bankrupt, and I believe the service that we need in the U.S., the safest airspace in the world, should be a governmental function. And what we should do is focus in on the problems. And I want to talk about the political part for just a minute. The political part, as venomous as Neil said, the politics are in Washington. I would say we would be remiss if we didn't point out that the airline industry in totality is really also responsible in some way with not having the industry, all parts of the industry and labor, get together, have a plan, and go to government with it. What we have, and each of you know that, because each of you have government affairs groups, and you go in and try to get your one little one-off so that you can come back to your board and say, hey, I was successful. But in the big scheme of maneuver, if we're that valuable to business, if we're that valuable to small communities, why are we regulated like we're regulated, overtaxed like we're overtaxed, and unable to affect change in Washington? And the reason is we can't rise above the noise level because we are all split apart. So if we were all working together, okay, and not pursuing our one little one-off, we would be able to get things done. Now, I will give my second and last compliment today to Boeing, okay? Boeing is without question one of the most successful companies I've ever seen affecting change in Washington. Okay, and we should all learn from that. Now, we all can't afford to have 400 people in government affairs and 19 outside lobbying firms, but we could, okay, working with everybody in this room and others that aren't here, take our primary issues, work together on those, together, and go to Congress and make that point. Right now, you walk into a room and say one thing, and although you might be in agreement with another colleague, the priority is different as he walks into the room talking to the same staff member. Okay, so the noise is not ever something that we can get through and actually affect change. And again, the outcome-based, the outcome is what we have now. Some inappropriate regulations and incredible taxation. So the answer is not privatization. The answer is to have the FAA execute on the things that we know, have someone accountable so we can push these things through and move forward. And I just wanted to make one comment on mixed fleet. You know, we hear a lot about mixed fleet, but hey, the reality on mixed fleet is you're always going to have a one-off, an emergency aircraft, something, so you always have to be prepared for that. That's the exception. And what I think we've let in the discourse, we've let the mixed fleet become the norm instead of the exception. So I think as we move forward, if you can't hang in there, you should be pushed aside, okay? And that's a policy discussion. But just like an emergency aircraft would have a different capability, perhaps, we have to look at it with mixed fleet. NextGen is not a light switch, okay? It's not a light switch. It's always going to have to be phased in. But we need to stop letting the economic argument of the person who is never going to pay the money, they get into it, drive the debate.
Yeah, and let's talk, staying on privatization for just a second. I don't think it's lost on anybody here that we're talking about a system that needs an investment in the tens of billions of dollars. And here we're having a very robust discussion at a forum with many industry leaders. And the FAA, one of the biggest drivers, can't be here because of sequestration and budget cuts. So we're at a point where we can't even fund one person to come and have this meaningful discussion, and yet we're thinking that we're going to have tens of billions of dollars somehow invested in the system. So there does seem to be a move, and as Ruth pointed out, from a political standpoint, aviation is at the top of the list these days, and we actually did get bipartisan support of a new law to get the controllers back. And so people are starting to seriously ask the question, is now the time to do privatization? So I'll ask Ruth. Obviously the 900-pound elephant in the room has always been the controllers and their concern with a privatization of the ATC system here in the States. So I'll open it up for you.
Well, when you say privatization, everybody has a different idea of what it means. The reality is there are almost three privatized air traffic control systems in the world. The vast majority are government-owned corporations, and that's what we see in the European model. And it all depends on what problem you're trying to solve and what you want as your outcome. So the European systems that corporatized did so to free themselves from the government bureaucracies and to develop a standalone funding stream, which was the, by and large, weight distance formula for user fees. So when we talk conceptually about privatization, I don't think we have a common understanding of what exactly that means. So it makes it very difficult to have that conversation. The first step in a process like that is developing agreement on funding and where the money comes from. And that's a big question for the operators of the system. And so what we see in corporatized systems, and it was a real difficulty for NAV Canada and UK NATS, is that if you have a weight-based user fee system so that you get paid basically for every kilometer flown, what happens in an economic downturn? And is your funding system stable enough to do this long-term investment? And the fact is it's not, because the economic system in good times and bad will always be cyclical. So the amount of revenue coming into the system is going to go up and down. So then you need to look at how you develop long-term funding stability. So there are people that say we need to be able to issue bonds and these long-term investments. And so then in a bond system, are you asking for users today to pay for a system tomorrow, or users tomorrow to pay for the system today? And these are very complicated questions that are financial industry questions. And we have it as an aviation industry. So it's difficult to get a good answer without just being wild speculation. So in wild speculation, I think that the US system under a privatized model would result in a lot of service loss for medium and small communities. I think it would very quickly go to an Amtrak model where these are the routes where the money is, and this is where the money is going to go. And it's all very interesting that there's a country in the middle, but the investment would be driven by the demand for the cities. So that's perfectly legitimate outcome. Each segment of the industry needs to ask if that's an outcome that they want, and that suits them. For air traffic controllers, how I'm paid is a personal issue, and it really doesn't matter because it's always in US dollars, no matter whether the company is a private company, the United States government, or any other structure. So my personal issues really are unaffected in the long term. My broader view policy issues that I care about this system and that I really am a big fan of the US air traffic control system because we can achieve things that aren't achieved elsewhere in the world is diminished in a privatized system because of the change in the allocation of investment. Everything that Neil said is absolutely true. Members of Congress defend their airports, their towers, and their jobs. That gives us a much broader network than if we didn't have that. In a private system, it becomes a more clear business decision. There are advantages to that, and there are disadvantages to that. So in terms of privatization, in many, many countries, it's been a very positive thing, the privatization being a corporatization, because it kept governments from funneling aviation income into other programs. It protected the revenue stream. In the US, you have to ask, do we have a net effect, right? Are we getting more money from the Treasury than we're putting in? And that analysis needs to be done by people who do economic analysis. I do air traffic control. So if you want to make that big decision, take a look at the big picture and determine, do we put in more money than is spent on us? And if we do, then it's probably a pretty good model. And if we don't, it's probably a pretty bad model.
And Nancy, you obviously work with many different organizations, a few of which are more or less private. So you want to give your thoughts?
So first, I would strongly encourage not using the word privatization, but use the word corporatization. Because I think what's meant, and I agree with Ruth that there are many different interpretations, is the funding stream is operating like a business. How many of you, let me ask you a different question. How many of you have worked with government procurement? Did you love it? Really good. The challenge that you have when you haven't worked with government is you don't realize how hamstrung you are with government rules. And what you need for the air traffic control system, which is a business, it's a 24-hour-a-day business, is to be able to operate on business rules and not on government rules, which are not designed for a business. So corporatization is a wholly owned government function which operates like a business. So I disagree that there would be issues. It's a service model, and Australia, for example, has lots of outback on the inback.
Yeah, but they don't have people. Okay,
They
so
don't have people?
they don't have that many people. I mean, you use Australia, you use Canada, and when you use this corporate idea, let's go back to 1978 with deregulation. Corporate, there's been 200 bankruptcies, liquidations, and mergers since the Deregulation Act. Now, could we have done a better job? Absolutely. But to say corporatization or privatization is the panacea for our problems is a huge misrepresentation. We have problems, we need to focus on the problems and not say privatization alone is the solution.
Well,
It's
how's
not.
the government working for you?
Well, right now we have the safest airspace in the world. Now, up in Canada, I represent the Canadian pilots, and we have a very safe system in Canada. But we have had an incident or two up here, and you know what? We're working through those things, and they're going quite well. But to say that a private system is safer, okay, I think
Yeah, I
is
didn't say safer.
Well, I'm just
I
saying you
said-
said the government. So I'm saying the air traffic controllers and how we work together in the entire system. The number one thing is it's going to have to be the safest system.
fully agree.
The number two thing, which really is driving the privatization argument, I think, is an FAA, you said earlier, communication problem. I still say it's an execution problem within the bureaucracy of the FAA. And again, privatization is a great discussion, but it's not the answer.
And Neil, just with a minute or two we have left, your thoughts on privatization, then I'll open it up to the floor, and then one final
I think
question.
I agree that you need to define it, what you're looking for, and what model fits your particular needs. I think defending the U.S. based on the safety of the system is misleading. I think the safety of the U.S. system is great, and so is the Canadian, and so is Western Europe. so that when you look at the numbers, we're not talking about degrees of safety. We're talking about how to get things done. And I think I agreed with Lee's execution piece. I don't think anything is a panacea. I agree with Nancy, what we have now doesn't work. That doesn't mean it's unsafe. It's not scalable. Ruth said it. You got about all you can out of this system. So how do you make the next step? How do you defend the growth of the system, the safety of the system, and how do you move it to the next step? The technology's there. We've got to figure out how to take that next step. And I would be more than willing, if there were a discussion on that, I would recommend with our 400 congressional lobbyist thugs and
Great guys, don't get me wrong.
but we would say that the unions have to be a key part of that discussion. Define it. What we're doing now is we're saying no, when what we have isn't working. It's working from the safety standpoint. I fly in the system at least 3 or 4 times a month on my own, not on an airliner. My wife and my kids fly in that system on their own. So I understand the safety consequences of it. I understand the concerns that the unions have, both the pilots union and the controllers union. And in my 40 years in this business, nobody ever accused me of being anti-union. I'm simply saying, let's sit down and talk about what would work better. Get the flow of money. Reduce the taxes. Even if you did user fees, would be cheaper than the taxes. It's killing the airlines. When now that we get to see the taxes on every flight, it's a fascinating game. I think the politics can be quietly moved off, Lee. I think that NATCA, ALPA, and industry partners airlines as well as associations and corporations, Embraer and Bombardier, we all have a self-serving interest in the growth of the system. Clearly, it's not magnanimous. I'd like us to think about what we can do to implement that technology.
Yep. And this has been hopefully you found it a very good discussion this morning. I certainly have. Before we close, I just want to open it up to the floor. If anyone has any questions, feel free to approach one of the microphones. We're happy to take any of your questions. But shy of that, just in closing, I'm going to continue on with Neil's question a little bit, and that is, within a minute or so, if each panelist could just give us, if we could do one thing as an industry, or a regional industry, or the entire aviation community, if we could do one concrete thing going forward to jumpstart NextGen, what would that concrete step be? Neil, you want to kick us off?
I would put dashboard outcome metrics in place, and I would put goals to those metrics, and I would hold the FAA accountable for meeting those goals, and I would have an economic penalty if they didn't meet it, both from an employee standpoint and from a user standpoint.
Okay, so set metrics. Ruth?
I would put all these distractions aside, privatization, changing the structure, and come together as an industry to talk about, in a very public way, how important aviation is to the United States economy, to the future of our country, and Canada as well. I keep forgetting that we're here. And really have a unified message, because we spend a lot of time, energy, and money disagreeing on minute points, and we have not made that unified message that our industry needs to be a high priority for the politicians of the United States.
Good, thanks. Nancy?
I would agree with both Neil and both Lee and also Ruth to a certain extent, in the sense that what we've done in the global system is just over the last 3 years put in priorities and targets. And I think that that's, perhaps I didn't say it correctly with the communication challenge, but I think that would be helpful to the U.S. is agree on what within NextGen is the priority, and what are those operational targets in the regions that are most important to aviation. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be very helpful in terms of communicating and focusing the organization of a lot of people that really deeply, deeply care on those particular outcomes.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. Lee, final thought.
Focus.
Yeah, and what's interesting, by that comment is I think one of the key challenges going forward is deciding what do we want to stop doing. Because it is very difficult to think of all of these things we're adding on, and if they're all additive, obviously it makes it very, very difficult. So to the same point, you have to look at what do you want to stop doing. We have a question on the floor?
Good morning. Jeff Cochran from NAV Canada. Very interested in hearing all of the comments this morning, and I don't want to weigh in on the corporatization, privatization discussion. I may have a biased opinion on that one. However, I did want to provide that as a background context for the question, in that how would you see managing the balance between mandates for things to get done and incentivization? And I know you spoke a bit about NAV Canada's model with ADSB implementation, where we used incentivization as opposed to a mandate in providing priority handling to aircraft. So as a general comment, how would you balance that between mandating things where you have some corporatized ANSs dealing with their own regulatory structure and incentivizing?
It's a good question. Thanks, Jeff. Any thoughts from the panel on mandates versus incentives?
A question back to you. Are you talking about unfunded mandates?
What do you mean by unfunded?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
yes.
sure-
They are unfunded.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah,
Unfunded.
I think you do both. I think you do both. If you can, when you instituted ADSB routes across Hudson Bay, that was a pull. You showed an economic benefit, and the airlines immediately said, I'll put equipment on my airplane. So that's a pull. That's a mandate. Clearly, they're going to use it. That makes a lot of sense. Same thing in the U.S. over the Gulf of Mexico. There's also has to be a push, because you want to incentivize early adopters and penalize late and last adopters. In effect, we do it the other way around now. I get a benefit by being the last adopter of the change. So you have to have a push and a pull. And again, it's not simple. It's a complex discussion that nobody seems to be talking about. They're not mutually exclusive. So where I can identify clear pushes, I'm going to do that. This is something, clear pulls, I'm going to identify, I'm going to do this because it makes economic sense. I'll put it, you save me 3 minutes of flight between Chicago and LaGuardia a year, and I'll put any box on that airplane you ask me to. That's the busiest air route in the world. So yeah, 3 minutes is a lot of money on those airplanes. But at some point, some of the older airplanes are going to have to equip, and you can put that over time. So I think you balance the two. But I think equipage is in perpetuity, because by the time those last adopters have the equipage, there'll be another box on the new airplanes. So you have to constantly refresh that capability, and I think it's not impossible. Is it hard? Yeah, it is hard. So you have to have mandates. TCAS would not exist without a mandate. Everybody understand terminal collision avoidance systems? That was a federally mandated system. There's no economic benefit that they saw. There clearly is. So you can't, we know that there aren't any mid-air collisions except for one where they violated TCAS in Europe in the last 20 years. So it's clearly got an economic effect. So certain things, safety-related, mandates, I'm all for. TCAS was a mandated approach. Everybody, including the FAA, opposed it. So you got to balance them. And you need somebody with a little foresight to understand when to push and when to pull.
And I see a lot of nodding heads here. Ruth, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, it's an important question, because incentives will never get us there. When they talk about, I need a business case in order to put this equipment on the airplane, unless, as Neil said, there's a penalty for not doing it, that business case will never be produced. Somebody said, we never made a business case for radios, but in order to operate in the system, you needed a radio. The biggest capacity enhancement we've seen in recent years was RVSM. And so you can still fly. We're not grounding any airplanes, but in order to fly in RVSM airspace, you need to be RVSM equipped. It ended up saving fuel. More people got to their preferred altitude. If you didn't, you were closer to it. There were a lot of economic benefits that came along, but the main benefit was it increased system capacity tremendously. We couldn't have done that on an incentive-based process. There had to be the lead time until this is effective to fly in this airspace, you need this equipment. And I like what Lee brought up about Cat 3, right? If you want to access this airport in poor weather conditions, you need this equipment on the airplane. And I do see that potentially in the future, that concept is applied to demand. If PBN improves the throughput of an airport by 10% during peak hours in order to land at that airport, you need that level of equipage. I could see that being an end state rather than weather-based, capacity-based. But an incentive-only system will never achieve the goals that we as an industry want to achieve.
Well, we do need to close. I thought this was an excellent discussion this morning. I think when you hear all of the interrelated pieces of NextGen, I think it's pretty clear that it's a very complex problem, and it's probably why we're still here talking about it. We tried to take a 30-year problem and put it into a 60-minute discussion. I think the panel did a great job, so please help me in thanking the panel this morning.